Hello, I'm back again, and I am reading you chapter 7 in the Memoirs of Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester. This is chapter 7 out of 29. It is entitled My Father's Caterpillar Car. In this chapter, she's heading off to Africa. She is not yet married to Prince Henry, and she talks about her adventures in chapter 7 and 8. She will be talking about her adventures and her time spent in Kenya. She went, I believe, on 3 trips. She really enjoyed it. She's got a very adventurous spirit. I made um I made I made a little video clip of her, and I put it out there for everybody to see. So I wanted everybody to see it. Right here are her watercolors. She did a lot of those while she was there, and I don't know, I think it was just a way back then for them to capture their time there. A lot of royals back then did watercolors. Prince Philip did them, Charles does them, Camilla does them. That was a way for them, a different way for them to capture their travels and the scenery, the beautiful scenery that they have. And this is one of her watercolors. And on her last trip, her father, like as I said, he was getting ill, but he helped her on her first trip. But by the third trip, he's like, I can't fund your trip anymore, and so she went and displayed these photographs, and she sold them, and that helped pay for her third trip to Africa. Over here is, I believe that's a picture of a caterpillar car. Some various different pictures of caterpillar cars that they had over there in Africa. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. So I'm going to just read this chapter. I call it Duchess Alice in Kenya. And I'm reading every word of this so that people can really see, when people write and they have wonderful writing, it's nice to include every single word because it really takes you, reading always transports you into where they're at. And I know people are really busy right now and want a synopsis, but I just really enjoyed this. I've read this book 2 times, and I hardly ever read books 2 times. Chapter 7. It was with some concern and sadness that I made this decision to move so far away. leaving my father in none too good a state of health. I knew he appreciated my company and was amused by my flow of local gossip and funny stories I could collect, not to mention my help with the crossword puzzles. He may have wondered why I should want to leave such a comfortable existence to visit a country so unknown and lacking in comforts. Maybe, too, he envied me, going off to a life so free of regulations and social responsibilities. He was very fond of his youngest brother and concerned about his severely wounded leg, and perhaps guessed that I would be of much help to him and his wife and family. Whatever his feelings, my father generously gave me my ticket for the journey and money for a car and petrol. And much to my relief, I later discovered he also cleared my large overdraft at the bank. My uncle and aunt, for their part, suggested I bring a girlfriend with me, and a lovely and delightful friend of mine, Mary Pole Carew, agreed to come along. So in the autumn of 1929, we set out on our great adventure, by train to Genoa and then by ship to Mombosa, the SS Landgraf Castle, in which we traveled. It took some weeks to reach Kenya, stopping at Port Said and Aden en route. Having traveled to and from the Cape by the west coast of Africa in Windsor Castle and Kildone Castle, it made a change to see something of the East Coast. Amongst the passengers were a few known to my uncle and aunt, settlers and officials returning to Kenya and Uganda. Lady Delamere, who was among them, owned a large property in Kenya. She was an attractive and amusing person, an exceptional good company. I was to meet her and her family on numerous occasions in the years to come. It was a night's journey from Mombasa to Nairobi, and none too comfortably a night with jolts and jerks and rings of bells. And when the train came to a halt at various small stations along the line, it was with relief that we found ourselves at Government House. At last, able to move the coating of red dust from our faces and clothes, the governor, Sir Edward Gregg, who later became Lord Eltrincham, and his good looking wife Joan, gave us a warm welcome. Government House was designed by Sir Herbert Baker, an architect and well known for many houses in South Africa as well as other government houses. It is a most attractive building surrounded by a large and lovely garden. Here we stayed in great comfort for a few days before setting off to my uncle's farm, which was Deloraine. Yeah, his uncle owned a farm called Deloraine, and that's where she was based out of. Now you can go visit it. It's a very cool place to go visit, and people do African safaris. And let's see if you can see. See, there you go, Deloraine House. A lot of people do these African safari. Oh, look at there's the book. I have that book. See, I've got that exact book. Um that is where she spent her time, and that was on the bed, so it's very cool. I mean, she had such an interesting life. So, and people do a lot of safaris there. I mean, they stay there, you know. So that just shows you where they're at. I like to keep a picture of her up so people can see This was Alice before she became was married. I'm a very visual person, so um it was a night's journey from Mombasa to Nairobi, and none too comfortable a night, with jolts and jerks ringing and bells when the train came to a halt at various small stations. Oh, I already read this part, so um, the next paragraph. The so called main road from Nairobi to Eldoret and eventually Uganda was exceedingly rough, with innumerable potholes and ruts, patches and corrugation, and clouds of red dust most of the way. It was a slow journey. The 140 miles took us most of the day, but for Mary and me, our eyes glued to the bush and plains, it could hardly have been more exciting. We saw countless wild animals, giraffes, ostriches, wild beasts, zebras, antelopes were everywhere, often scarcely bothering to remove themselves from the road, while nervous families of monkeys or a leopard would occasionally dash across in front of us. Today, the number of animals has drastically diminished. The road one speeds along at 70 miles an hour is a tarmac. The pioneering sense of those times has long gone, too, but the story is not lost. The days of settlers who went to make a life in Kenya in the early decades of the present century are delightfully recalled. They made it their home. It's a collection of stories with an introduction by Elizabeth Huxley, published in 1962. Of all the books I've read, this best covers the period before and while I was there. Hot and tired and once more covered in dust, we eventually arrived at our destination. Here I was to make my home for over a year. A dozen or more Africans were assembled to greet us. Hearty handshakes and chatter were exchanged by all, and much interest was shown in Mary. New arrivals were a rarity. There too were Uncle Francis, Aunt Eileen, and my cousins Pam and Moy, and the governess. In 1920, my uncle, along with a number of other ex Army officers, decided to start a new life farming in Kenya. After the war, the British government had decided to encourage British citizens to settle in the colony, and they organized a lottery in England to this end, apportioning, apportioning land to all who entered for it. My uncle's number, when drawn, turned out to be a piece of land very distant from town or railway. As his daughters were then aged 4 and 2, this property seemed too isolated for him to risk taking it on. Luckily, however, someone proved willing to make an exchange. So he ended up with a place halfway between Nairobi and Eldoret. In terms of communication, this was ideal. Being near to where a hospital was, built 28 miles away in Nakuru and only 4 miles from the nearest railway station in Rongai. When my uncle and our aunt arrived with their 2 small children and the indomitable Miss Loder, my aunt's maid, they had to live in 3 mud huts while they organized the building of the house. Later, they named it Deloraine, after a hill on the family estate in Selkirkshire. Bricks were made locally by Indians, who were only people capable of that sort of work. Deloraine was one of a few houses in the colony to have a second story. By the time I arrived, there was already a lovely garden of well kept lawns and shrubs. Miss Loder had established herself as something of a local legend. She was everything: housekeeper, nanny, cook, dairy, and dairymaid. My aunt left her in complete control, and accordingly, she would be on the go all day. She was cursing, screaming, shouting, and generally bullying the African boys, who took it all with the greatest of good humor. There were many good houseboys, completely uneducated and speaking only Swahili. They could not have been more good humored or obliging. The same applied to the workers on the farm. In most cases, the men were incorrigibly lazy. They would sit gossiping, dash out, and work madly at the sound of someone coming, then stop the moment they could get away with it again. This was the tradition. The women worked and the men did not. To do so for them was an indignity. The attitude was general, but its effects were particularly noticeable at Deloraine because of the spirit of toleration that presided there. Francis Scott was one of those people who never thought ill of anyone. As a result, a succession of somewhat unhelpful managers was left in charge. While he attended to his parliamentary duties in Nairobi as a member of the Legislative Council, Aunt Eileen was a most unsuitable person to embark on life in such primitive conditions. Nevertheless, she did so with the greatest courage and good humor. As a girl, she had lived all her life in the height of comfort, first at her home at Minnetonka in Scotland, and later as a daughter of the Viceroy of India. She tried to lead a life in Kenya as near as possible to what she had become accustomed to in the past. Deloraine was grandly furnished with family pictures, and silver was laid for every meal. She would rise late in the morning and always take great care of her appearance, never appearing without hat and gloves, and usually with a parasol as well. The Africans found it almost intriguing. However, she did design and start the lovely gardens, which now have flowering shrubs of brilliant colors 9 or 10 feet tall. She also made a kitchen garden on either side of the small stream, in which were grown many English vegetables, including asparagus. Fig trees did well, but the figs had to be enclosed in little bags. Otherwise, they would be eaten by monkeys. Apart from this, she read novels, and whenever it was possible, played bridge. She loved music and the theater, and must have missed these sadly while she was in Kenya. Gramophone records were the only music to be heard, apart from native tom-toms beating in the distant villages. Mida, when visiting Deloraine in the early days, was invited to a dance some 40 miles away, and a young man offered to drive her there. On hearing his Aunt Eileen had felt bound to accompany her as a chaperone. A deck chair was erected in the back of the box body car, and Aunt Eileen, perched there, had set off. Mida and the young man chatted away and arrived at the party in no time, only to discover to their horror that Aunt Eileen had vanished. Everywhere was in a state of confused indecision when, to their profound relief, she reappeared in someone else's car. Her rescuers had been traveling through the bush when, to their amazement, they had found their way blocked by a lady sitting on a deck chair under an elegant parasol. It was typical that when I first arrived in Africa, she insisted on only two things. One, that I should wear a red flannel spine pad and a red lining to my hat. Everyone wore a wide brimmed felt hat in those days as protection from what were generally considered to be lethal rays of the sun. Both the spine pad and the hat proved tiresome in a hot country. I wore them religiously till I arrived on my second trip to find, to my relief, that such garments were no longer thought to be necessary. Of course, not all African men were lazy, and Uncle Francis was especially blessed in that he had a Maasai tribesman of extraordinary devotion as his personal servant. This was unusual because the Maasai were the proudest of tribes and normally deemed any kind of service beneath them as contempt. But Eru, my uncle's servant, was exceptional in that a white man had saved his life. During the First War, he had been a soldier in the Kenyan African Rifles, and after a skirmish with the Germans, had been wounded and left to die on the battlefield. One of the settlers, Mervyn Ridley, His officers at the time bravely rescued him and subsequently saw to it that he was nursed back to health. Eru, in return, pledged his life to him. Mervyn Ridley was in no need of further employees at the point, so he passed Eru on to my uncle. He proved the most faithful servant anyone would want and was dearly beloved by all. I was scarcely less privileged in my own servant, Kimani. He was in his mid-20s and acted as my maid and my motor boy and bodyguard. In fact, he did everything. Kamani was assigned to me as soon as I arrived. I paid him 6 pence a day, which covered his food and all living expenses. And I bought him clothes, several pairs of shorts, some loose white shirt-like garments, and a red taro brush and blankets. If needed, I would also buy some extras for him, like wood. We motored hundreds of miles alone together with no trace of anxiety on my part. No one could have been a more dependable or trustworthy companion. If we stayed somewhere and he suspected another boy of mischief, he would ask me to hand over my money, jewelry, and anything else. And I had that might tempt a thief or would take him into his own safekeeping for the night. To have such confidence nowadays would be rare. Once Kamani came to me and asked if he could have the day off the next day. I agreed, but I asked him the reason. I have to cook something that I might take a particular old tree because of my little son is ill. And the witch doctor says I must do that to make him well again. But Kamani, I remonstrated, I thought you were a Christian. Oh, yes, I am, he said seriously. But it's just as well to be on the safe side. This conversation was, of course, conducted in Swahili. Few Africans at that time were able to speak English. On one occasion, his zeal for my well-being was overdone. Finding some brand new laces in my shoes instead of the old, worn out, and knotted ones, I asked him where he had got them. With great pride, he had taken them out of one of the other Bawana shoes. But that's awful, Kamani, I said in horror. It's stealing. Oh no, he replied confidently. Kamani's not stealing for Kamani. It's for Mesahib. But that's worse, I said, because it makes me a thief. Oh no, said Kamani. Mesahib did not do it. There was nothing more to be said. That was how he had worked it all out and his way of thinking. Necessity soon forced me to pick up enough of the language to make myself understood. So Alice was learning some Swahili. That's so interesting. Every white person was given a name by the Africans. My aunt, for instance, always wore earrings, so she was called Mesahib Kingeli, which means earrings. When I arrived for the first time, I was named Mesahib Mawa, which means flower, because I like to pick bunches of wild flowers for my room. Giggling hordes of children from the village would invariably follow me around on my walks, mimicking my movements with glee and picking vast bunches for themselves, which they would subsequently press on me. They just thought I was rather dotty to do such a thing, but the local witch doctor was positively disapproving. If I passed his house on my way home, he would give me a nasty look, which I returned with the sweetest of smile. Annoying him even more, my Mesahib Mawa days, however, were relatively short-lived, because when it was learned that I had flown away and returned again by air, I was rechristened Mesahib Ndege, meaning bird. There were only a few private planes in Kenya at the time, and people who traveled in them were viewed in the consequence with understandable awe by the locals. Kenya seemed so peaceful in those days. The Africans were always smiling and contented. There were spectacular amounts of game of every species, and the bush, as one drove along, was a glory of magnificent cedars, podocarpus, and crimson flame trees. In other ways, however, traveling was not always a joy. The roads, even the main roads out of Nairobi, were formed only of packed mud, which soon deteriorated into wheel tracks, often rutted so deeply that you have to move to one side or the other and make a fresh track. Much of the soil, known as black cotton, became impassable and like a peat bog after rain. Box body cars, mine was a Citroen, were the most commonly used at that time, and one had to put chains on the tires when it was wet. Oh, okay. I'm going to X out of that and show you what a Citroen. Okay, apparently that's what they had to use. Okay, so can you see that? That's a Citroen car. That's a Citroen car, so that's what they had to use. Box body cars, mine was a Citroen, were the most commonly used at the time, and one had to be put chains on the tires when it was wet. A roll of chicken wire was all carried to lay on the mud or for crossing a sandy riverbed in the chains could still not get a grip. Yeah, that's really interesting. I grew up in Chicago. We had to put chains on cars in the snow just to get that traction going. Um, Bridges were a rarity, and whether there at all often consisted of no more than a couple of stout planks to which the wheels yet again had to be precariously aligned. Often fords or dry riverbeds were suddenly turned into torrents by the after effects of electronic storms taking place in a different part of the country upstream from where one was. At these times, the motor boy, who was always in attendance, would survey the prospects and, if necessary, lead the car through the flood. Water to his knees. Water was up to his knees. If it is proved too deep, there was nothing to be done but wait till the level dropped. As a result, bedding and food were usually carried. The chances of meeting other travelers were remote. Having omitted to have her injection before leaving England, Mary fell ill shortly after our arrival with a mild attack of typhoid fever, necessitating her removal into Nakuru War Memorial Hospital. Visiting her was made no easier by the fact that it was the rainy season. One morning, therefore, when the day broke fine and sunny, I took the opportunity of paying her a call. I started for home under a bright sky with plenty of time to spare before nightfall. However, as was always likely to happen, the day turned cloudy and threatening as soon as we were engulfed in a downpour. Driving became very difficult, and we went slower and slower. Eventually, we arrived at a fork in the road and stopped because I could not remember which to follow. Not having learned any Swahili at that point, I was unable to consult Kamani, so there was no alternative but to plunge on into what seemed to me to be ever more an, an ever more unfamiliar country. My growing despair was then lifted by the encouraging sight of tail lights of a car ahead, and soon I was behind it, hooting for all I was worth to make it stop. The driver appeared not to hear, and for all my miles of hooting did not stop till we arrived at this front door. When he emerged, he looked at me with astonishment. I've been hooting and hooting, hoping you would stop and show us back to the right road, I said with exasperation. I'm so sorry, he replied, but you see, I've been expecting a friend to come and stay. I thought it was him hooting just to let me know he was there. Well, it wasn't, I said rather technically. I explained our predicament while he asked me in for a cup of tea. So, he said eventually, give me a kindly smile, giving me a kindly smile. You'd better stay the night. I can't do that, I said, because my uncle and aunt would be so worried and upset. As soon as he discovered who they were, when he became most respectful and insisted on escorting me for several miles and seeing me safely across the river close to our farm, I never met him again. But my uncle and aunt knew of him, and much later I heard he had been killed while on safari. Mary soon recovered enough to leave the hospital, and we took her for Christmas to Mervyn Ridley's house, Capsalat, up north of Eldoret, and then back to the government house for the new year. There was a large party there for polo, racing, and other festivities, and among the guests was Sir William Gowers, Governor of Uganda. He was nicknamed Wicked Willie because of his roving eye for the ladies. That sounds like somebody. He thought Mary and me were rather fun and promised that if we were to come to Uganda, he would personally escort us to the mountains of the moon. We accepted this with much joy, but unfortunately, by the time we arrived at Entebbe, Sir William was indisposed with phlebitis. However, he was as true to his word as he could be and lent to us his ADC, Sidney de Salis, to escort us. To complete the party, we collected John McNabb, who he had met on board our ship on the way out. Before we left Deloraine, Aunt Eileen had told us to take matches and a candle with us. This we did, and it was just as well as we found no lights at all in the bungalow at Crater Lake. There were alarming grunting noises all night, but as the only light was providing for our candle, we could not work out where they came from. We discovered from their footprints in the morning dew that our visitors had been a troop of hippos. We never saw the mountains on the moon. They were buried in the cloud, but we met some very friendly pygmies who seemed most interested in us. Before Mary left us for home, we were invited yet again to Government House in Nairobi, this time to a party for the Prince of Wales. Mary and I, being about the only unmarried young females around at the time, were, I suppose, a welcome addition. Also staying were Baron and Baroness Blixen, the authorities' Isaac Denison, the Lord and Lady Delamere, Dennis Finch Hatton, a famous white hunter, Titch Miles and his sister Dolly, and my uncle and aunt. Only Dolly, Mary, and myself remain alive. The prince was staying there a few days before going off on a safari. He objected strongly to the rule that he should always be accompanied by a doctor, and this caused some worry amongst those responsible for the expedition. In the end, unknown to him, Dr. Bainbridge, an eminent Nairobi doctor, was sent along in a disguise as the driver of the royal car. Well, they did have to protect the heir, but then he abdicated, so that's the point. It was not long, sadly, before Mary had to leave, as she was expected in England shortly. I wanted to go to Zanzibar, and so did she. So we decided to combine a trip to the Sultanate with her homeward voyage. It did not sound too difficult to arrange. You can always get a ship from Mombasa to Zanzibar and back, somebody said. You just go to the booking office in Mombasa. We went, and we were told, on the contrary, that the only ship due to sail for Zanzibar in the immediate future was a Japanese cargo boat. Is that all right? We asked anxiously. Oh, yes, they assured us. It only took 6 passengers, but it was clean and it was very comfortable. You embarked at 5 in the afternoon and arrived in Zanzibar by 9 the following morning. Once on board, we were rather surprised to find that the dining room was shared with the crew and consisted of a long room in the middle of the ship with a huge table down the middle and 3 passenger cabins giving on it from each side. The crew was very polite, but giggled uncontrollably at everything we said, and with each lurch of the ship throughout the night, our doors embarrassingly swung open to reveal our cabins to anyone who might still be at the table. In Zanzibar, we stayed with Mountbatten and attended a dinner and dance with the Sultan's birthday. The Sultan was a charming old man and very pleased to see us because it gave him a chance to return the hospitality he had received from my family on his trips to England. He had even been up to the borders, where he had been given a grand tour by Walter, including an inspection of the Buccleuch's pack of foxhounds in the hunt kennels at Boswell. It was both odd and comforting to speak of such homely things in such an exotic place. The next day, he had most courteously accompanied us on a tour of the island, and I made a pilgrimage of my own to see a memorial plaque in honor of my uncle, Dick Bridgman, who had died there while on duty with the Navy in the First World War. He had been in an engagement with the German battleship Königsbergs, which had taken refuge in a Tanganyikan river. We also discovered, somewhat to our relief, that the P and O line on which Mary had booked her passage home conveniently included Zanzibar in its itinerary. So there was no need for us to take our lives in our hands on foreign cargo boats if we were to see Kenya again. At Mombasa, we said goodbye, and I returned on my own to Deloraine. And that is the end of chapter 7. So there's one more chapter, chapter 8, that describes more of her adventures in Africa. I mean, she had quite an experience, which is good to have before you find yourself embarking on a royal family, marrying into the royal family. So